There is a specific kind of silence that only happens when the power goes out and does not come back. It is not the silence of a quiet evening. It is not the comfortable hum of a house settling. It is the absence of everything you did not know was running until it stopped. The refrigerator, the router, the HVAC unit, the background noise that your brain had learned to filter out so efficiently that you forgot it was there at all. And then, in the space of a second, it is gone. And in that silence, something happens inside most people. Something that has nothing to do with the weather outside or the transformer that blew down the street. Something that starts quietly and builds slowly over the hours that follow. And that something is the realization that you are not as prepared as you thought you were. Most people believe they are prepared. They have food in the house. They have water in the tap. They have a phone that still has a charge. And for the first hour, those things feel like enough. The first hour of a blackout is almost always fine. People light candles, joke about it, scroll through social media on their phones, and wait. They wait because every power outage they have ever experienced before ended within a few hours. The lights flickered back. The refrigerator hummed back to life. The router blinked its way back online. And life resumed. But this video is not about the first hour. This video is about what happens when the lights do not come back. When you wake up the next morning and the house is still dark. When your phone is at 40% and you realize you have not found your charging cable yet. When the food in the refrigerator has been sitting without power for 18 hours and you are not sure what is still safe. When the tap is running, but your neighbor who works at the water authority texts you to say that boil water advisories may be coming. That is when the 9 things in this video stop being abstract concepts and start becoming the most important objects in your home. We are going to count them down from 9 to 1. And what you need to understand before we begin is that this is not a list of dramatic survival equipment. This is not a list of things that only preppers and survivalists think about. Every single item on this list is something you can find in a hardware store, a grocery store, or a pharmacy. Some of them you probably already own. But owning something and knowing exactly where it is, how much of it you have, and how to use it when everything around you is failing, those are 3 completely different things. By the time we reach number 1, you may find that the most critical thing you are missing is not an object at all. Let us begin. Number 9 is something that most households have never thought about in the context of a blackout, because it feels too simple, too low-tech, and too obvious to be worth thinking about. It is stored water, not filtered water, not bottled water from a store. Stored water. Water that you have put aside yourself, in containers you control, before anything went wrong. Here is why this matters more than people realize. During extended outages, particularly those caused by infrastructure failures, severe storms, or winter events that freeze pipes, municipal water systems can fail, become contaminated, or require boiling. The 2021 Texas winter storm is the most well-documented recent example of this in American history. Approximately 12 million Texans lost access to safe water, not because they ran out of water, but because the pipes froze, the pressure dropped, and the risk of contamination from pressure changes became real. The boil water advisory in some areas of Austin lasted more than a week after the storm. Here is the part most people did not think about before that week arrived. Boiling water requires heat. Heat, during a power outage, requires a source. If your stove is electric and your power is out, boiling water is no longer a simple act. If you have a gas stove, you may be able to light it manually with a match. But if your gas supply is also compromised, which happens in some storm scenarios, you're left with nothing. The Federal Emergency Management Agency recommends storing at least 1 gallon of water per person per day, with a minimum 3-day supply for evacuation scenarios and 2 weeks for sheltering in place. Most American households have 0 gallons stored. What they have is the assumption that the tap will keep working. The proper way to store water at home is to use food-grade containers, not old milk jugs. which are difficult to sterilize and tend to degrade. Clean, dark-colored containers with tight seals, stored away from direct sunlight and away from any chemicals or fuel. If you are using tap water that has been chlorinated, it can safely be stored for up to 6 months before needing to be rotated. After 6 months, the chlorine dissipates and bacterial growth becomes a risk. The mistake most people make with stored water is that they think about it once, fill a few containers, and then forget about it entirely. They do not label it, they do not rotate it, and then 3 years later, during the first real emergency that tests them, they open a container and find something they are not comfortable drinking. Water is not dramatic. It does not make for exciting content, but it is, physiologically, the first thing your body will need. You can survive weeks without food. You cannot survive more than 3 days without water. And yet, it is almost always the last thing people prepare.
Things aren't always what they seem.
That imbalance is exactly what this video is about. Number 8 is manual lighting, but not in the way most people think about it. Everyone knows that candles and flashlights exist. Most households have at least one of each somewhere in a junk drawer or a closet. The problem is not the concept of manual lighting. The problem is quality, quantity, and placement, and the specific ways that inadequate lighting creates dangers during extended outages that most people do not anticipate until they are already living through them. The U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission has documented this extensively. Candle fires cause an estimated 7,600 home fires annually in the United States, resulting in around 80 deaths each year. And the data is consistent about when those fires spike. They spike during power outages, when people are using candles in ways they are not accustomed to, in rooms where they have never placed candles before, and falling asleep while candles are still burning because they have nothing else to provide light through the night. A flashlight with fresh batteries is significantly safer than an open flame, but most households have flashlights with dead batteries, and the batteries they have stored elsewhere are often the wrong size. There is also the issue of duration. A standard alkaline AA battery powering a conventional flashlight may last 6 to 10 hours of continuous use. If your outage extends beyond that, and extended outages by definition do, you need a system, not just a device. What experienced preparedness households keep is a combination of systems. They keep LED lanterns with long-duration batteries. They keep solar rechargeable lanterns that can sit on a windowsill during the day and provide light through the night. They keep headlamps, not flashlights, because headlamps free your hands, which matters when you're trying to cook, treat an injury, or care for a child in the dark. And they keep their lighting equipment in a known location, not in a junk drawer mixed with old batteries and rubber bands, in a specific place that every member of the household can find in total darkness. That last point is more important than it sounds. Darkness is disorienting. It creates anxiety in children and adults alike. The 1965 Northeast blackout, which cut power to approximately 30 million people across 8 states and parts of Canada for up to 13 hours, generated documented spikes in reports of panic, disorientation, and accidents related to navigation in the dark. People fell downstairs. People cut themselves on things they could not see. People made decisions under psychological stress that they would not have made in the light. Lighting is not just about visibility. It is about the psychological stability of everyone in the household. Darkness compounds every other problem an outage creates. Adequate lighting reduces that compounding effect. Number 7 is a manual can opener. This will sound absurdly simple, and it is. But every experienced emergency manager and every preparedness organization that documents real household behavior during outages will tell you the same story. People have canned food. People do not have a manual can opener. They have electric ones. They have the pull-tab cans that do not require openers at all, but only for some of their canned goods. And when the power goes out and they reach for the opener they have used for years, they find that it requires an outlet. But the can opener is not really the point here. The can opener is a proxy for a much larger failure mode, which is the electric dependency gap. Modern American households have become almost entirely dependent on electricity for food preparation in ways that go far beyond the obvious. Electric stoves, electric kettles, electric rice cookers, electric coffee makers, electric blenders, electric microwaves. When all of those disappear simultaneously, most households are left with a pantry full of food that they cannot easily prepare. This is where the category of no-cook pantry foods becomes critical. Peanut butter, crackers, canned fish, canned beans, the kind you can eat cold if needed, though they taste better heated. Nuts, dried fruit, granola. These are not emergency rations in the dramatic sense. They are foods that require no heat, no electricity, and no complex preparation. They are foods that a family can live on for several days with their dignity and morale largely intact. The mistake most families make is having a pantry full of foods that require electricity to prepare, and almost nothing that can be eaten without it. Rice requires a stove. Pasta requires a stove. Frozen food obviously requires a freezer. Even most soups and canned meals are more palatable when heated. A family that has thought about this in advance has a different pantry than a family that has not. They have layered their food storage to include things they can eat immediately without any preparation whatsoever, because they know that the first night of an extended outage, when everything is still new and disorienting, is not the night to be figuring out how to light a camping stove they have never used before. Number 6 is heat or cooling, depending on where you live and what time of year it is. This is the one that kills people. Not metaphorically, literally. In 1995, a heat wave struck Chicago for 5 days in July. Temperatures reached 106 degrees Fahrenheit with heat index values above a 120 in some areas. The city's power grid was severely strained. Rolling blackouts affected parts of the city. Residents without air conditioning, particularly elderly residents living alone, had no relief. By the time the heat wave ended, approximately 739 people in Chicago had died from heat-related causes. It remains one of the deadliest weather events in modern American urban history. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has studied it extensively as a case study in how heat exposure combined with social isolation becomes a mass casualty event. The inverse is equally documented. During the 2021 Texas winter storm, the extended power outage left millions of people without heat for multiple days in temperatures well below freezing. At least 246 people died from causes directly or indirectly related to the storm, including hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning from people attempting to heat their homes with grills and generators inside enclosed spaces, and accidents related to icy conditions. Carbon monoxide poisoning from improper generator use deserves its own emphasis. The Consumer Product Safety Commission documents generator-related carbon monoxide deaths every year, and they spike dramatically during extended power outages. Generators must be operated outdoors, at least 20 feet from any window, door, or vent. This is not a suggestion. People who run generators in garages, even with the garage door open, have died. People who run them in enclosed porches have died. The odorless, colorless nature of carbon monoxide means the body gives almost no warning before incapacitation. For heat management without electricity, the foundational principle is thermal mass and insulation. Gathering the household into a single room, preferably an interior room, and insulating that space with blankets, sleeping bags, and closed doors significantly reduces the energy needed to maintain a survivable temperature. A family of 4 in a single room generates meaningful body heat. That heat, trapped in an insulated space, can mean the difference between a manageable night and a dangerous one. For cooling, battery-operated fans, cool wet cloths, and awareness of when outdoor temperatures drop below indoor temperatures, so you can open windows strategically, are the low-tech solutions that work. Number 5 is a first aid kit, but not the one you think you have. Most American households have a first aid kit. What most of them actually have is a small plastic box with a handful of bandages, an old tube of antibiotic ointment, and perhaps a pair of scissors. Some of those kits have been unopened for 5 years. Some of the supplies inside are expired. The antibiotic ointment may have dried out. The bandages may be insufficient for anything beyond a minor cut. During extended outages, the risk profile of household injuries changes significantly. People are navigating in the dark and falling. People are using candles and open flames and burning themselves. People are using manual tools they are not accustomed to. People are attempting home repairs in difficult conditions. And people who rely on electric-powered medical equipment, oxygen concentrators, CPAP machines, electric wheelchairs, insulin refrigeration, face a category of risk that does not receive nearly enough attention in mainstream preparedness conversations. The American Red Cross publishes detailed guidance on what a comprehensive household first aid kit should contain. Beyond basic wound care, it includes medications, pain relievers, antihistamines, antacids, anti-diarrheal medication. It includes a thermometer. It includes any prescription medications the household depends on, stored with enough advanced supply to cover at least a week. This last point, prescription medication supply, is one of the most commonly overlooked preparedness failures in documented emergency response assessments. People run out of blood pressure medication during evacuations. People run out of insulin during extended outages. People run out of the psychiatric medications they take daily, and then face a medical crisis on top of an emergency. The first aid kit is also the right place to keep a printed list of household medical information, conditions, medications, dosages, physician contacts, insurance information. When a family member is injured in a crisis and you are the one calling for help or going to a hospital, having that information on paper means you do not have to reconstruct it from memory under stress. Number 4 is communication. Specifically, the ability to receive information when the internet is down and your phone battery is dying. Here is a reality that took many people in Puerto Rico completely by surprise when Hurricane Maria struck in September 2017. The storm caused the most catastrophic infrastructure failure in the history of the U.S. territory. The entire island lost power. Cell towers went down. Roughly 95% of cell sites were knocked out within the first days after the storm. And then the outage did not last for a few days. It lasted for months. Some parts of Puerto Rico did not have power restored for nearly 11 months. By the time cell service partially returned, many residents had been without reliable communication for weeks. The lesson from Maria and from similar events is that cellular communication, including internet-based communication, is fragile infrastructure that fails during exactly the scenarios where you need it most. Your smartphone runs on a battery that lasts between 8 and 20 hours, depending on usage. If you cannot charge it, it eventually becomes a paperweight. And even if your battery holds out, if the cell towers serving your area are down, the phone itself cannot communicate regardless of its charge. A battery-powered or hand-cranked no-A weather radio is one of the most important and least glamorous items a household can own for emergency preparedness. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Weather Radio Network broadcasts on 7 frequencies and covers nearly all of the United States. It broadcasts continuous weather information, government warnings, evacuation orders, and emergency alerts directly, without requiring cell service, internet, or any infrastructure beyond a working receiver. During nearly every major extended outage documented in recent U.S. history, no AA radio remained functional when everything else had failed. Beyond no AA radio, a written list of emergency contacts, actual phone numbers, written on paper, is something almost no one has anymore. We have outsourced our memory to our phones entirely. When the phone dies, the contacts die with it. A single sheet of paper with the phone numbers you would need in a genuine emergency takes 5 minutes to create and costs nothing. During a crisis, it can be the difference between being able to reach someone and being completely isolated. Number 3 is cash. This is the item that provokes the most skepticism when preparedness educators bring it up. And it is also the item that tends to produce the most visceral regret in people who have lived through extended outages. When the power goes out, electronic payment systems fail, credit card readers fail, debit card readers fail, ATMs fail, digital payment apps, Venmo, PayPal, Apple Pay, everything that runs through an internet connection, fail. What remains functional is cash. Physical currency, the kind that requires no electricity, no internet, no server farm in another state to validate. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, cash became the dominant currency in affected areas for weeks. Businesses that had managed to stay open, particularly smaller local operations, only accept cash because their point-of-sale systems were down. People who had cash could buy fuel, food, and supplies. People who did not have cash could not, regardless of how much money was theoretically in their bank accounts. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta published research on post-Katrina payment behavior that documented this dynamic explicitly. The finding was straightforward. In disaster scenarios, cash functions when nothing else does. How much cash is appropriate to keep at home is a personal calculation, but most preparedness organizations suggest enough to cover a family's essential needs for 3 to 5 days. Fuel, food, medications, and emergency accommodations if evacuation becomes necessary. Small bills are more useful than large ones because the stores that remain open during a crisis often cannot make change for large denominations and may refuse to try. Cash also represents a broader principle that the next two items will develop further. When systems fail, what matters is what you have in your physical possession, not what is theoretically accessible through digital networks. Number 2 is sanitation supplies. This is the item that almost no one talks about, and it is also the item that, historically, has killed more people during extended disasters than violence, exposure, or starvation combined. In the aftermath of major infrastructure failures, sanitation systems, sewage, garbage collection, waste treatment, are often the first to fail silently and the last to be restored. During the Puerto Rico blackout following Maria, wastewater treatment plants lost power. Raw sewage began flowing into waterways. Flooding mixed with sewage created contamination risk across communities. The CDC documented elevated rates of gastrointestinal illness and skin infections in the months following the storm, directly attributable to sanitation failures. The 2010 Haiti earthquake provides the most devastating modern example of the relationship between infrastructure collapse and sanitation catastrophe. After the quake, cholera, a disease spread through contaminated water and fecal matter, was introduced into the compromised environment and killed approximately 10,000 Haitians over the following years, infecting hundreds of thousands more. The scale of that disaster was shaped not just by the earthquake itself, but by the collapse of sanitation infrastructure in the environment that followed. For American households in extended outage scenarios, the relevant risks are less dramatic, but still meaningful. If water pressure drops, toilets may not flush properly. If sewage lines are compromised, using toilets at all may become inadvisable. Hand washing, the single most effective infection control measure known to public health, requires water. If water is scarce, hand washing gets rationed. When hand washing gets rationed, illness spreads. What sanitation supplies look like in a preparedness context is practical and unsexy. Hand sanitizer with at least 60% alcohol content, as the CDC recommends. Disinfecting wipes, heavy-duty garbage bags, which can serve as portable toilet liners in scenarios where plumbing is compromised. Feminine hygiene products, diapers if children are in the household. Bleach, which can be used to disinfect surfaces and in carefully measured doses to treat water. Basic soap, real soap, not just hand sanitizer. Because soap physically removes pathogens from surfaces in ways that alcohol does not. The failure to think about sanitation before a crisis is almost universal among households that have not specifically engaged with preparedness. And yet, in every documented extended outage, sanitation becomes a central problem within 48 hours. It is the need that builds quietly, that is embarrassing to discuss, and that creates genuine health risk when ignored. Number one is not something you can buy at a hardware store. Number one is a plan. Specifically, a household emergency plan that every member of the family has been part of creating, has been given enough information to understand, and is practiced often enough that it does not require electricity, internet access, or a calm mind to execute. Here is what the research from FEMA, the Red Cross, and decades of post-disaster behavioral analysis shows consistently: the difference between households that manage extended crises competently and households that fall apart under the same conditions is almost never about equipment. It is almost never about how much food they had or whether they had the right flashlight. The difference is almost always about whether they had made decisions in advance. Calm, unhurried decisions made before anything went wrong, that they could then execute under stress. A household emergency plan answers specific questions before those questions become urgent. Where do we meet if the blackout happens while family members are at different locations? Who do we call if local lines are down and we need to reach an out-of-state contact? Who is responsible for gathering the go bag if we need to evacuate? Which neighbor do we check on because they live alone and may need help? What do we do in the first hour? And what do we do if things have not changed by the first morning? Children who have been included in creating a household emergency plan, not lectured at, but actually included in the conversation, asked for their ideas, given real roles, respond to emergencies with measurably less panic than children who have never been part of that conversation. The research on this goes back decades, and it is consistent across cultures and disaster types. Children who know what to do when something goes wrong are not frozen by fear. They act. They feel capable rather than helpless. And in a household dealing with a sustained crisis, capable children change the emotional environment for everyone. The plan also covers the items in this video. Where is the stored water? Where are the batteries? Where is the cash? Who knows how to light the camping stove? These questions, answered in advance and written down somewhere that does not require electricity to access, convert a household from a group of people reacting to events into a group of people managing them. A plan also forces an honest reckoning with the gaps. When you sit down to make one, you discover that you do not have a manual can opener. You discover that your first aid kit has nothing in it but expired supplies. You discover that no one in the family knows your out-of-state contact's phone number from memory. The plan, before it is useful as a plan, is useful as an audit. It shows you what you have and what you do not, and it gives you the opportunity to close those gaps on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, rather than during the first night of an outage that is showing no signs of ending. There is a phrase that emergency management professionals use that has never been bettered for simplicity and accuracy. Prior planning prevents poor performance. The version that is specific to disaster preparedness is even simpler. People who prepare do not panic. They execute. 9 items. Water. Lighting. No cook food and a can opener. Heat and cooling management, first aid, communication, cash, sanitation, and a plan. None of these require a bunker. None of them require a significant financial investment if approached gradually. None of them require an extreme worldview or a belief that catastrophe is inevitable. They require the same thing that every other form of adult preparedness requires: the decision to think about something uncomfortable before it becomes urgent. The people who did not have stored water in Texas in February 2021 did not believe they needed it before that week. They were not foolish people. They were normal people who had never faced a scenario in which the tap stopped working. And so, they had never prepared for one. The people who did not have cash after Katrina were not careless people. They were people who had been part of an economic system that had made physical currency feel obsolete. Until the moment the power went out, and the system itself went with it. Preparation is not about fear. It has never been about fear. It is about the freedom that comes from having options. When a blackout extends into its second day and your house has water, light, food you can eat without electricity, a way to stay warm or cool, a working first aid kit, a radio that tells you what is happening, cash in case you need to buy something, sanitation supplies, and a plan that everyone knows. You are not in a crisis. You are in an inconvenience. You are the household that your neighbors are going to come to. You are the family that is going to look back on that week and feel something surprising. Not relief, not pride exactly. Just the quiet, steady satisfaction of having done something right before anyone told you that you needed to. The question is not whether you will ever need these things. The question is whether you will have them ready before or after the moment that teaches you that you need them. The lights go out, and in that silence, either you are ready or you are learning. If this video made you think about something in your home that you have been putting off, the next conversation worth having is about your pantry. Specifically, what you have in it that does not require electricity to become a meal. That is where most households find the largest gap. And it is the gap that, over the next days of a sustained outage, becomes the most personal.
No can opener.
We will get into exactly that next time.